Hello. So let's explore a little bit more about this relationship between the binary and non-binary, and how this can look within the 9 genders framework. First of all, I'd like to premise this with saying that I'm a researcher. So this is what I plan on researching. One of the problems that people seem to be having is non-binary people have to tell their story over and over and over again, and there's no real way to record basics around their story, around where they sit as a trans person, or as a non-binary person, or as a trans masculine person, and how these terms can be used to reflect where they are, and where their physical bodies are compared to where their gender is, and how that can be communicated at a glance when they're dealing with the medical profession, so that they're not having to tell their story over and over and over. Okay, so the first group of people that I want to talk about here are, people with male bodies and people with female bodies, right? So in the 9 genders, there's two parts. There's the physical, and then there's the gender. So the physical is the sex, and the gender is how you feel, how you identify. So a person with a male body and a female gender essence can transition into the binary, where they end up with a female body and female gender essence. But that is a long process. And there are different designations that I'm proposing that they would go into during that transition. So a person with a male body, if they started taking female hormones, then that male body of theirs would grow breasts. So that body would no longer be typically male, because they would have female breasts. So I would suggest that that person would become physically non-binary, because they don't fit into the physical definition of male, because they have female breasts. So that person would transition into non-binary, which would be an intermediate designation if that person's end goal was a transition into a female body. Okay, so that can happen with hormones for a person with a male body. So a person with a female body and a male gender essence, right, could transition from a female body to a male body, and then would have a male body with a would have a male body with a male gender essence. So if that person with a female body had top surgery, then they would transition into non-binary, because their female body would not be typical female without the breasts. Okay, so that would be a transition, right? So the first stage of transitioning is really into a non-binary body. So this is a gingerbread man that we're talking about, right? So people talk about the gingerbread person, sorry, not man person. The gingerbread person is, the gingerbread person talks about non-binary physical body. So a physical body that does not fit into typically male or typically female. So the second part of that transition for a person with a male body and a female gender essence, right? Well, now that person they were identified male at birth. They took hormones, transitioned into a non-binary body. Now, if that person went on to get bottom surgery, then they would transition from non-binary to female. So then that person would have a female body with female gender essence. Now, how would we refer to, I think maybe for designation purposes and for research purposes and for medical purposes, it might make sense to call that person trans female, because they had a male body and they've transitioned into a female body. So that would be trans female, right? So for the person with the female body who had top surgery, transitioned into non-binary, right? If that person had bottom surgery, then they would transition their female body into a male body. So that person could be considered, I think the best definition for that person would be trans male, right? So I think when we're talking about a person who's had top surgery, but not bottom surgery, right? You might call that person trans feminine because they haven't completely transitioned. So they'd be non-binary, yes, but within that non-binary designation, they would be trans feminine. Okay, because again, I'm proposing that non-binary is an umbrella term for a lot of gender diversity. Okay? So, I think trans masculine and trans feminine we can also look at that as it is as the gender side of the equation. So the physical side of the equation, or the person's sex, is on this side, and the person's gender is on the other side, right? So if a person hasn't had any surgery, has not taken any hormones, so a male body and maybe a female gender essence, right? I think that person could consider themselves, and that person considers themselves trans, then they would be trans feminine, right? And the same thing, if a person with a female body is presenting and dressing as male, so they're doing a social transition, by binding or, putting forth a male presence, then that person might be considered trans masculine. So there's some things to think about. So hormones and bottom surgery, trans male. Hormones without bottom surgery, transmasculine, hormones without bottom surgery, transfeminine, and no hormones, no surgery, social transition, transfeminine. Okay? This is what I'm proposing, and I would like to really look at in research. Okay? So, the female body, right? With the social transition, transfeminine. Female body, top surgery, transfeminine. Female transition to a male body, which includes top surgery and bottom surgery and many other surgeries. So masculinization of masculinization surgeries and things like that would happen as well, and that person would be trans male, right? Okay, that's what I'm proposing, and of course, so that's what I'm proposing in the definition. So the definitions we have, right, that could be kind of jigged around to make sense, to be able to look at a medical chart or be able to look at where a person sits and understands where a person sits from a term, right, would be female with a male gender essence, male with a female gender essence. So, right? So the first would be transfeminine in the non-binary category. The second would be transmasculine in the non-binary category. A social transition would also be within the non-binary category and could be transmasculine and transfeminine. Okay? Now, once they've had the surgeries, again, top surgery and bottom surgery, then I would suggest that that person be trans male, right? And the person that has had hormones and bottom surgery would be trans female. Now, I think this is important because if a person is in the hospital, something has happened, and they're unconscious, then this designation, in their chart, there could be non-binary, transfeminine, right? So that doctor that's looking would know that, hold it, this person has male genitalia. So we need to figure that into the equation when we're treating this person physically. Okay, the same goes for transmasculine. So non-binary transmasculine would have female genitalia, and they would have to figure that into the treatment if they were unconscious in the hospital. And that could be on a medical chart, right? So that story doesn't have to be shared over and over and over again, right? So at a glance, there would be able to be some kind of understanding of where that person sits within the non-binary definition. And the same thing goes. If that person in their chart it says trans male or trans female, they'd know that neither one of them were assigned male or female at birth, but have transitioned into male and female, and that might be important if they were unconscious and in the hospital and treatment was happening with them, to give the doctors a full picture of who they're dealing with there. So this is why I say that the 9Genders framework is a stable framework that we can fit things into to tell a bigger story of what's going on with that individual person. Now this is what I'm proposing, so please subscribe to my channel. Like if you're looking at it on Facebook or TikTok, and follow on TikTok or follow on Facebook, and please subscribe on YouTube so that you will get the latest updates as these revelations come through. And if you look at some of my other ancestral videos, you'll see that I am connected to my ancestors. And these understandings that I got, just as I got the 9Genders framework from my ancestors, I'm getting these revelations of how to look at gender and how to maybe help society understand transgender and non-binary a little bit better, because right now it's this great big mystery thing, great big mysterious thing, and it doesn't have to be. But we have to look at these things within research, right? And in order to do the research, like the research I'm proposing to look at doing is going to be quantitative research, which is looking at numbers. So high numbers of surveys. And each of those surveys are also going to be looking at different races and different categories of people. So that's going to be looking at the numbers and how that's playing out, and then looking at that intersectionally, because of course a black person is going to have a different experience, and a white person is going to have a different experience, and a Latino person is going to have a different experience, then a Chinese person is going to have a different experience than a Ukrainian person. All of these people are going to have different experiences based on how they were raised and how they grew up, and which community they were raised and grew up in. So this is what I'm proposing. So please, again, like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you.